Thanks for the support there, Jack, on this campaign speech for me. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for having me. I thank CN Railways for the support to the Center and your other sponsors. But I came to speak to you about the top of the world, which is, as I mentioned last night, it's all 68% of it's maritime, it's ocean. And so that has attendant issues and challenges for the whole of the top of the world. The picture I have here, maybe to start this off, since this is a Canadian-American venture, this center here, and with the General Counsel here, and our relationship with Canada is so close. It's a Canadian ship. Obviously, I put it there because it has the name of Arctic. The MV, the motor vessel Arctic, sails in the Canadian Arctic to global markets around the world, carrying bulk cargo. It's been sailing. First, this ship was a Crown Corporation and a research experimental ship. Now it's operated by FedNav, a Montreal-based shipping company that operates a very advanced, the most advanced Arctic ships on the planet. So here's the MV Arctic. I have a couple bullets there on this first slide, which I want you to keep all of what I say in this context. It's obvious, I think, to all of us, maybe in the room, but maybe not all in America, and maybe not everyone in Canada, that, but I think in Canada it would be true to say that most people know that the Arctic is the epicenter of climate change on the planet. Clearly twice the temperature rise is in the Arctic, twice that of mid-latitude, so rapid climate change is key to this topic of the changing ocean. But equal to that is the globalization of the whole Arctic, the globalization of the marine world. In other words, the linkage of Arctic natural resources to global markets. Vast resources at the top of the world, from Russia, Canada, Greenland, and in the state of Alaska where I live. So across the whole top of the world, there are tremendous natural resources which really drive the marine system. If there's a message in my talk, it's that, not surprisingly, economics is driving the top of the world and the change, besides the environmental change. But not to be dismissed of the rights and the aspirations of the indigenous people, particularly the folks who live on the coast, but all the indigenous people in the Arctic. I work in the Arctic Council quite a bit, and the Arctic peoples, 6 indigenous groups are represented actually at the table with the 8 Arctic states, and they're called permanent participants. So the challenges of the Arctic indigenous peoples there are many challenges, and this should be, all of what I say, the operation of ships in the Arctic, development resources should be taken in that context, that there are people who live there, which is a lot different than the Antarctic, of course. And then finally, but equally important, are regional and global geopolitics. Regional geopolitics is related to the United Nations Law of the Sea and the essentially carving up of the seabed under Article 76 in the Law of the Sea, which allows the coastal states to reach out beyond 200 miles to almost 300 miles. And what does that dynamic mean to the top of the world? And finally, places like Ukraine and the Crimea, and how does external geopolitics impact the top of the world? The Arctic is not independent of the rest of the world, and some of these forces are at work. But nonetheless, today, and hopefully in the future, all of us are working on this, we keep the Arctic a peaceful place, one of the most peaceful places on Earth, in addition to, of course, Antarctica. I want to tell you a little bit about Arctic traffic today, marine traffic, and the global links. Talk a little bit about sea ice retreat and what it means for greater access along the seas navigation at the top of the world. I'll mention briefly about the Russian Arctic and what is happening in the Maritime Arctic and reach of the Russian Federation, developing LNG, oil and gas, lots of minerals in the Russian Arctic that, of course, support the GNP and are very important to the future of Russia. I'll mention this Arctic marine shipping assessment which we conducted. We, several hundred experts from the 8 Arctic states and indigenous groups NGOs, maritime companies, and then finally I'll pose what I think might be a plausible future of the Arctic. As Jack mentioned, he deals with integration and complexity. If I have anything to say about it all, hugely complex, and a great number of uncertainties, huge number of changes at the top of the world, no easy path forward, but nonetheless. Now here's the Arctic Ocean stripped of the ice cover with the seabed, and you can see in the light blues, particularly on the right side of the top of the world here, the broad continental shelves that reach out from the Russian Federation. There are fairly broad shelves off Alaska, as you can see, the Canadian archipelago, some shelves around Greenland, but nonetheless, these broad shelves indicate the potential for oil and gas exploration. But in the center of the Arctic Ocean, I don't know if anyone knows how deep it is there. It's 4,000 meters, essentially 2 miles deep at the North Pole, so hard place to develop resources at that depth. But nonetheless, people are thinking about it around the planet. It's about 2,200 miles, nautical miles across the top of the world, so it's not a short distance. It's longer if you go to the right on the Northern Sea route and the left through the Canadian archipelago in the Northwest Passage. Shallow, essentially shallow ocean at the top of the world, but 5 times larger than the Mediterranean, so it's not a small place. Ice cover in 2015, I just wanted to show you what it looks like in the summer for the traffic. We'll put the traffic in here. And you can see the routes in only summertime meaning roughly August, September, and October. The rest of the year, today, and in the near-term future, is ice covered, either fully or partially ice covered. So that's one of the important points to make. The place is not ice-free. Despite profound climate change, profound changes in thickness, extent of ice, and the character of ice, moving from multi-year ice that survives seasons to all-seasonal ice, all of those changes, despite all of that, the ice cover is present. So the ice cover for 2,000 miles is present for ships that may want to cross. Technically feasible. The question always is it economically viable? That's the question for the marine transport world, the global shipping enterprise. You can see on the right side the routes across the Northeast Passage and the Northern Sea route of the Russian Federation. Multiple routes. There are some 8 well-defined routes through the Northwest Passage in the Canadian Arctic. You can see routes along the west coast, generally the west coast of Greenland, routes around Iceland, routes around Svalbard, and back and forth from the Norwegian coast. So lots of marine traffic, about 7,000 voyages in 2015 of ships, including fishing vessels, all the way up to large cruise ships. 7,000, not too many in the global context when you think that about 18,000 ships go through the Suez Canal every year, and about 12,000 through the Panama Canal, just through the canals. The traffic, all of these lines in this map are developed with automatic system on the ships that we can track the signals that are required. These systems are required on ships that operate under the IMO codes conventions. And you can see the green, all of the green along the Alaska coast is tug and barge traffic. Except for Kivalina, in the middle of the image, you can see it's a place called Kivalina. It's the Red Dog Mine. It's the largest zinc mine in the world, and large ships come and anchor and carry zinc ore to global markets. On the left side of the image, all of those multicolors represent large cargo ships on the Northern Sea route. So around Chukotka and into the Russian Arctic by Wrangel Island and to the west is all traffic on the Northern Sea route. But I wanted to show you what it looks like in the wintertime. This is all seasonal traffic. This is June to November. And here's what the same traffic pattern looks like in the winter, just to make the point. And if I showed the images of the Canadian Arctic, if they had such a system, and they do track all of this marine traffic in different ways, this is what we would see. Lots of traffic in the summertime, in a 5-month period. No large ship traffic, but lots of people out on the ice, indigenous hunters, but no large ship traffic. Occasional icebreaker, occasional research ship, but none this long winter period, winter now extending January through May. So most parts of the world in the Arctic, it's seasonal traffic. It doesn't mean that you can't make money and have viable ship systems. It just means that it's constrained by the ice cap. Here are some numbers that represent the connection of today's Arctic to the planet with regard to various commodities. International fishing, really that number, 10%, relates to the Bering Sea and the Barents Sea, two of the world's most productive fisheries. So 10% of the world's fisheries are located north. Perhaps there will be more fisheries in the high Arctic, in the central Arctic Ocean. There's still some questions about that with acidification of the ocean and some other issues, short season of the ecosystem production. But nonetheless, there's a potential for more fisheries in the central Arctic Ocean. The hard minerals of the Arctic, palladium, nickel. Palladium and nickel are all located in the Russian Arctic. All of that, 1/5 of the world's nickel is located in one place. It's located in Norilsk, the mining complex in western Siberia. Palladium as well. But we mentioned diamonds yesterday in the context of Canadian diamonds, but about 20% of the world's diamonds is in fact in Greenland, Canada, and Russia. I don't think there are too many diamonds in Alaska. A few maybe, but platinum and zinc, 10% of the world's zinc is located in one place, the Red Dog mine in Alaska. So very important commodities, minerals, wealth in the top of the world. You need ship systems, because none of these, very few of these can be moved by rail. They're moved by ship. The estimated hydrocarbons at the top of the world, the place is really a gas province. I'll show you another slide on this topic. But there is oil. The major areas of oil are in the United States Maritime Arctic, in the Beaufort Sea, that crosses over into, of course, Canadian Arctic, in Greenland, and in the Kara Sea in the Russian Arctic. So oil and gas are huge, particularly gas and now LNG being exported from the Russian Arctic. Rare earths, we hear about rare earths. The world's largest stockpile of rare earths is in China, but about 25% is located in Greenland and Russia and some in Canada. Coal and fresh water, lots of coal at the top of the world, particularly in Alaska. And fresh water, we bring, fresh water may become, as you all study here, a global commodity and an important one for life and existence here on the planet. Lots of fresh water in the Russian Arctic, Canadian Arctic, in Alaska. We, in fact, in Alaska, send bottled water to Japan today. So somebody makes money doing that. It's quite fascinating that you can do that and make money as a bulk cargo. When we were doing this big shipping assessment of the Arctic Council, we learned that fresh water is carried by bulk cargo ships, by ships like the MV Arctic, to Barcelona every summer to make sure that their water supply is enough to carry them through the summer and dry months. So if you can do that and make money, we can move fresh water out of the Arctic to global markets. The tourism industry is a niche market for the top of the world, and regional trade to northern communities like Alaska and Canada and Russia are very important to the existence of these coastal communities. So when you package all that together, lots of commodities, lots of trade, lots of opportunity for shipping these commodities out of the Arctic to global markets. Here's just some words about this study on the oil and gas conducted by the United States Geological Survey. Russian data, Canadian data, Danish data, all composited together to take a look at what areas of the top of the world have high potential for oil and gas. And all of them are coastal. All the red dots represent coastal areas. And when we were conducting the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, we were interested in particularly coastal areas where we had to develop measures of protection for the Arctic and the marine coastal areas. But you can see that there are none, there's little potential likely in the center of the Arctic Ocean, where it's deep water, 4,000 meters or more, in and around the central basin. So most of this is coastal. The key issue is, the geopolitical issue is, all of these areas are under the coastal state sovereign control. So you have to deal with the coastal state, whether it be Canada, the United States, Russia, Norway, or Denmark for Greenland. You must deal with a sovereign state with permits, regulations, etc. for all of these areas. An important issue. We're not in the high seas, we're in the coastal sovereign state control. I don't know if you remember this, but it got lots of play. In fact, I think on the cover of Time magazine, as I remember, this is Dr. Tillingar, a well-known polar explorer, member of the Duma, deputy of the Duma at one point in time. But he went and took the Mir 1 and Mir 2, these submersibles, 2 miles down to the center of the top of the world, and then planted it across the Russian flag. What you don't see is that this was a joint venture with Australia. So the picture is not taken with the Australian flag, which is actually also at the North Pole, off to the side from the Russian flag. This has no meaning in international law, but certainly got lots of press, and it shows the intentions, at least illustrates the Russians thought about who owns the place in the top of the world, and what kinds of measures are to be taken there. However, the Russians are playing by, they are close. Maybe we're not. This map shows if you extend out 200 nautical miles under the United Nations law of the sea, in that dark line, what's left over is the high seas of the Arctic Ocean. And that's what's essentially a common heritage of mankind. It's owned by all nations of the world. The water column, but not necessarily the seabed. Under Article 76, one of the devices in UNCLOS, the coastal state is allowed to extend the continental shelf. You have to do the science. You have to look at what the sediment is, the grade of the seabed, etc., lots of criteria. Now, a lot of countries around the world, like Australia, have done this around the whole of the planet, but in the Arctic, it's still underway how we partition this. So the gray areas left, this is one model, there are many models, but the gray areas tell us, these little donut holes that are left over tell us that none of the, most of the high seas will be under the seabed, will be under the sovereign state control. So there won't be much left over. If you want to drill, and let's say, I won't pick on China, I'll say Japan this time, you want to drill for oil and gas in the Arctic Ocean, you'll have to deal with the coastal state or drill in one of these no man's land, essentially high seas area that is not under sovereign control. So essentially, bottom line is the place is kind of locked up. The seabed's locked up. None of this relates to freedom of navigation or fishing in the high seas. It just relates to the seabed. Now in 2008, the Arctic coastal states, 5 Arctic coastal states, Canada, the United States, Denmark, who else? Who have I missed here? Russia and Norway, got together in Ilulissat, Greenland, and stated that, look, we hear that there are folks who want to have an Antarctic treaty at the top. Antarctic treaty essentially sets aside the continent of Antarctica for all of mankind to conduct science, and sets aside all of the claims of the claimant countries, sets those aside. But of course, it's very different at the top of the world. Places owned by the sovereign states. So setting it aside in some sort of global arrangement where everybody owns the place is not happening, and it's not realistic. So, but the Arctic states, the coastal states, 5 of us, had to mention that, oh, by the way, the Arctic Ocean is one of the oceans of the planet, pretty straightforward, and UNCLOS applies. And the only ripple in this, of course, as you probably know, is that the United States, having helped to design, with Canada and the Soviet Union back in the 80s, the whole of UNCLOS, for principally freedom of navigation rights around the planet, has not ratified. The United States has not yet ratified. And we're in cahoots with countries like Syria, North Korea, who haven't ratified. Everybody else has. There's always a problem, and it's the U.S. Senate problem, in getting folks understanding. Now, one of the impediments, I think, of the politics of it is that this is called the UN something or other, Law of the Sea Treaty, Convention on the Law of the Sea. And you know, a lot of our senators probably are not enthusiastic about the United Nations and our very large contribution to it. But nonetheless, for our operation of the Navy, for this partition of the Arctic seabed, there are multiple reasons why the United States needs to ratify, and we'll see what happens. But nonetheless, this LULUSAT declaration is important to the geopolitics of the Arctic, where the sovereign states have mentioned very emphatically that UNCLOS is the framework for law at the sea, for the legal framework at the top of the world. So some points about sea ice and retreat. Messy plot here. All of these going from left to right are the simulations for the amount of sea ice, the area of sea ice at the top of the world, through all of these models. And in the red you can see that's the observed record when we see every year, use satellites and take a look at how much area. And if you carry that a line through the red dots there all the way down to the bottom, it looks like somewhere around 2040, the entire Arctic Ocean basin, maybe 2050, right at the middle of the century, will be ice-free for instant at time, but likely ice-free from August, September, maybe parts of October. In other words, none of the ice will have survived, at that point in time, none of the ice will have survived through the next season, called multi-year ice. So all be first-year ice, still be 2 meters plus thick in the wintertime because of the cold temperatures, but nonetheless, all of it, for the ice breaking, for the marine operations, it's a bit easier to break this kind of ice rather than seasonal ice. Anyway, the trends are very clear. This is not, but the trends are, this does tell you that there are some warts in the computer models, the global climate models, which can't actually simulate the observed record. It's much faster than we can model. These pictures are called passive microwave images. The ice is in false color. So the purples and reds represent a high ice concentration, and the yellows and light blues represent lower concentrations. But nonetheless, if you take a slice of the data, and I picked a minimum year in the summer for 2012 and for 1979, now, if you look at the right, vast areas are black. They're open water, ice-free, which further extenuates the warming of the ocean as through the long summer, greater and greater heat is absorbed in the great area that is not ice covered, because the ice cover, of course, is a barrier for some of the incoming heat from the sun. And if we look at the 2 minimum extents in the historical record, the satellite record in recent times, you can see most of the area on the Russian side, on the right side of the maps, is generally ice-free for a period in summer. Very complicated picture on the left side, in the Canadian Arctic and the archipelago. Very difficult to model that area with the GCMs, the global climate models, because of the geography. But I remind you all that the place is ice covered. This is recent data in the last 2 winters and spring of these satellite images, which show that the place is entirely ice covered for at least 4 or 5 months out of the year. The ice may be thinner, a little bit less extent, a little weaker in places, but the place is ice covered. And if it's not ice covered, there's a problem. In order to melt the top of the world, the sea ice cover at the top of the world would require 10 to 15, 20 degrees higher elevation and temperatures throughout the wintertime, and the temperatures in the mid-latitudes and lower latitudes would be so extreme that it's questionable whether our species would remain. So we want the place to be, and it will always be ice covered, likely throughout the whole of the winter, unless there's some radical change in the climate. But nonetheless, this ice cover, of course, does present for marine transportation a bit of a barrier. We have done some simulations of traffic through the Arctic, mostly on the Russian side, but you'll see a little bit on the Canadian side in a minute. This is a current picture of running ships through the simulations of sea ice, and then running a polar-class ship through those simulations, and this is what we get. A lot of openness, a lot of opportunity in the Russian Arctic. But if you go mid-century, roughly mid-century, we can see that the center of the Arctic Ocean will be likely ice-free for maybe 3 months at a time. And the question is, on that red line, who might take advantage of moving from Pacific to Atlantic or vice versa? What bulk cargo could be carried, what container ships would be carried, and also through the Canadian archipelago, through deep water channels of McClure Strait and whatever on the left side. So we can at least look at the simulations and the ice record and defining a class of ship and running them through the simulated ice conditions to see what we might have. Again, in the summertime. Lots of possibilities, but huge complexities and a number of important uncertainties as well. On the Russian side, they've already taken advantage of this new era of using and developing Arctic resources. This is a offshore terminal, a place called Varendy in the Kara Sea, southeastern corner of it is called the Pechora Sea. But it's an interesting collage of technical exchange, really. Ships are developed in Finland, the technology, built in Korea, operated by a Russian shipping company. But the platform was developed with investments from Lukoil, Russian federal oil company, and of course ConocoPhillips, the United States. So in order to develop this particular complex of offshore terminal and ice-breaking tanker, it required international collaboration on technology exchange. Complexity in itself. Finnish designed and built container ship that sails from Norilsk to Murmansk, carrying nickel plates in the summer, but in the wintertime, year-round, but in the summer can go from the place called Dudinka port all the way into the Pacific to the east. And this ship is interesting, it has no rudder, and this electrical propulsion system, which you see with a single propeller here, can rotate 360 degrees. So very novel and new technology, which is another factor in the development of the Arctic. Very efficient ships that actually sail in reverse through the ice because they're more capable with this propulsion system and the flow of water around the hull. So new technologies can impact the ability of ships to have greater access and longer seasons of navigation. This plot shows the growth and then the crash of traffic related to tonnage of cargo. During the Soviet era, you can see reaching up to a peak of about 6.6, 6.7 million tons of cargo. All of that cargo was ore, nickel ore, principally going from Dudinka and Norilsk all the way to Murmansk and to the smelters in the Kola Peninsula during the Soviet era, when all of the Soviet Union was independent of global commodities markets. And then a crash at the end of the Soviet Union, where there was very little traffic on the Northern Sea route, except for supporting the coastal communities. Then a period for a decade or so of average deployments of ships, and then all of a sudden here we now have a rise of tonnages of cargo coming out of the Russian Arctic to global markets. There have been a number of full transits, but small numbers. You can see them here over the last few years, but not many ships going from ocean to ocean. Mostly what happens are ships come from the Russian Arctic out and back in a regional called destinational shipping. But the newest operation in the Russian Arctic is this LNG terminal built essentially in western Siberia on the coast of the Yamal Peninsula. And they envision using ice-breaking carriers to carry LNG year-round to the west, to Europe, and then eastbound in the summer defined maybe July, August, through even mid-November with Icebreaker escort. So the Russians here are developing the Russian Maritime Arctic, coastal areas, western Siberia, and attempting to export LNG, liquefied natural gas, with a liquefied natural gas plant in the middle of Siberia. It's a very interesting connection of resources of the Russian Arctic to, again, global markets for gas. Extraordinary ships. These ships are essentially like the 1,000-foot ore carriers here. 300-meter LNG carrier, ice-breaking ship. The ore carriers here can survive the ice here on the Great Lakes, but not necessarily ice crunchers, icebreakers. But these are really icebreakers in their own right. Huge investment by Chinese and Japanese companies and Russian Sokomflot, largest shipping company in Russia, to, again, here's another image of trying to link LNG from the Arctic around to ports in the Pacific and of course, in Europe. There are some differences in shorter distance, of course, to Europe from Siberia than it is from the Persian Gulf, but the distance is kind of averaged out between the two places when you're going from the Persian Gulf maybe to Japan and China. Let me say a few words about this marine shipping assessment because it focuses on environmental protection of people in the place and marine safety. And it was interesting that the leaders of this study on the Arctic Council were Canada, the United States, and we brought in Finland. When you're a lead country, you have to put resources and talent and people, although this study was really worked on by a whole range of people from all the 8 Arctic states, indigenous communities. We did hold these town hall meetings in indigenous communities around the Arctic, and we touched base with maybe 5,000 indigenous people, not many, but at least an attempt to reach out and see what the concerns of indigenous people were. Large study, lots of moving parts, looked at history, governance of the Arctic Ocean and the UNCLOS, but we did do an exercise to try to handle this complexity. Our customers in this study were the diplomats, of course, of the Arctic Council, senior Arctic officials, Arctic ministers of the Arctic states, and a full range of observer countries and observers, NGOs. But nonetheless, we want to get a feel for this idea of complexity, that it's just not the simplistic notion that the sea ice is going away and the ships are coming. Well, that may be the case, but for the global shipping enterprise, you have to make $1 or €1 to make it happen. We had about 130-odd uncertainties that we teased out of this 70-person exercise for a couple of years. And here are the top 20 of the issues. And if you look down, you see oil prices. At the beginning of this large study, oil was about $147 a barrel. Great for Alaska, great for the Russian Federation, great for Canada, offshore and the East Coast, wherever you have and developed oil. Yesterday, I think it was $57 a barrel. But at the end of the study, it was $50 a barrel. That one driver influenced greatly Arctic marine transportation at the top of the world. But you can see all the other legal issues. The shift to nuclear energy, we were thinking that at the time of the study, the nuclear energy might play a bigger role on the planet and might tease away from the movement of oil and gas development offshore in the Arctic. But of course, what happened? We had the disaster, the tragedy in Japan, and we even heard from the Chancellor of Germany that Germany is moving out of the nuclear industry. So sometimes these scenarios, exercise, can be disrupted by a particular wild card that you wouldn't think of. Major shipping disasters. During the course of this study, we had a ship sink in the Antarctic with passengers. You can see, maybe you can't see the smiling passengers in the lifeboats down in Antarctica, but nonetheless, they were there. But fortunately, if you see in the upper left, a Norwegian ship was about 100 nautical miles away to come and pick up. Of course, the explorers down at the bottom of the Southern Ocean as we speak, and the passengers were luckily picked up with no loss of life. But this is the kind of thing that we could see. This ship was up in the Canadian Arctic just 6 months previous. So this is the thing we were dealing with in trying to define the measures and the framework for how to protect the place and people in the Arctic for ships. This is our scenarios matrix where we then developed stories about these different this Arctic race, Arctic sagas, where we really wanted to go. We figured that we were probably in the Arctic race block during the study of the high demand of resources, unstable governance. And so governance, whether you have international rules and regulations and a stable base system, or it's unstable with no rules, which were we under when we did this study. So this is a way to handle, at least, writing the storylines of plausible futures of the Arctic. The recommendations we had covered these three themes. Marine safety related to IMO, the International Maritime Organization, rule-based international non-discriminatory rules for ships, protecting people, the environment, dealing with invasive species, oil spills, linking with coastal communities, enhancing communication, a whole range of issues. And then the third issue, which you wouldn't think would get a lot of play, and it's a kind of nebulous term, this term, infrastructure. Maybe when we have our panel, we can talk about this topic. There is no infrastructure in the top of the world, except for the coast of Norway, world-class infrastructure, ice-free country, right, along the coast, not in Svalbard, but along the coast of Norway. There's infrastructure in Iceland and in northwest Russia. If you, maybe our visitors in Canada could identify all of the infrastructure in the Canadian Arctic, and there's not much. There's some. Only about 9% of the place, the whole of the Arctic Ocean, is charted and modern international standards. I'll put it in context for the United States. I'm close to this, dealing with this NOAA Hydrographic Services review. About 4.7% of the United States maritime Arctic, which goes from the Aleutian Chain all the way to the Canadian U.S. border in the Baltic Sea, only 4.7 is charted to modern international standards. Now, we have charts for the place, but if you look at the charts, the large areas where there are no soundings, a couple soundings from Captain Cook back in his day. In the Canadian Arctic and the Russian Arctic, there are now some corridors that are well charted, but only in very specialized regions where you have some depth of water. And so all of the countries are working on the charting, but it takes decades to get the resources. So just charting, besides search and rescue responsibilities, salvage, aids to navigation, robust communication, a whole range of infrastructure that requires vast infrastructure. The question for the Arctic states is that the sole responsibility of the taxpayer of the Arctic states, or is industry a partner in this in a public-private partnership? Huge issue, one to be discussed more. After the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment came out, the Arctic states negotiated a new search and rescue agreement, and this map just shows the areas of responsibility of the Arctic states, and you can see more than half the places covered by Russia, makes sense, and Canada, a fairly sizable, but also Finland and Sweden, you can see in the upper right, they have territory, of course, in the Arctic, and so for an aeronautical SAR, they're included as well. So all the 8 Arctic states are in this arrangement of search and rescue. Lots of words on this chart, but I'll mention this polar code. The operative organization on the planet that deals with the global shipping enterprise is the International Maritime Organization in London. And so from 1993, at the beginning of Canada's insistence that we start to develop special rules for the Arctic and the Antarctic, from 1993 to this past January, when the Polar Code came into effect in both polar regions. So 24 years, it took, quarter of a century, my time, my life, spent on this particular rules and regulations development. Ship structural standards, safety equipment on the ships, training, expertise of the mariner, who's driving and what is their experience. But this device, this new set of rules, also requires a polar ship certificate. So you go aboard as a Coast Guard officer, Canadian enforcement official, and you ask the captain right away for the polar certificate. and then you also required to have an operations manual devoted to the ship. The environmental rules under MARPOL, the Maritime Pollution Convention, SOLAS is the Safety at Sea Convention, STCW, Standards of Training, Certification, Watchkeeping, all these acronyms of the IMO. But no discharge of oil, no discharge of liquid, noxious liquids, some discharge allowed, not in Canada, for sewage in the polar regions, and some discharge of garbage. Very somewhat complicated set of new rules, and then here's the boundary. What's fascinating as a geographer are the new maps of the Arctic. Lots of new maps and new dimensions. Search and rescue map. Here's one on the Polar Code. Overlapping and differences of these boundaries. Besides the boundary disputes, not many in the Arctic left, but nonetheless they're there. Let me finish by giving you at least my vision of what the top of the world might look like from a maritime perspective. Hopefully, and it looks like because the Arctic states want to sell resources to the rest of the planet, particularly Russia, Norway, and Greenland, but certainly in North America, we, the United States and Canada, would like to sell a lot of resources to local markets. The place likely will remain peaceful. We have in Alaska the largest military complex outside of Russia in the Arctic. We have missiles in the ground, in fact, and we have now advanced fighters, and so we have a large military in Alaska for lots of multiple reasons. More engagement of the non-Arctic states. We clearly see investment from places like China, Japan, Korea, maybe even Singapore, in dealing with investments and development of infrastructure in the Arctic. The resources aren't going away. They're there forever and to be developed, hopefully sustainably and safely in the Arctic. And all of these resources, some can be carried by pipeline, but most will be carried by ship. And so you need the supporting infrastructure. As I noted, none of the countries are resource dependent. Certainly Russia, Norway, and in many senses the future country of Greenland, haven't talked about that. But at least 3 out of the 5, the 8 Arctic states are dependent upon this natural wealth. Climate change, not abating, continuing, man-induced, of course, anthropogenic. The sea ice continues to retreat, creating new areas of marine access. But it's unlikely, because of the seasonality of the sea ice, that the global trade routes will be retooled, where more traffic will go across the Arctic than through the Suez or Panama Canal, of which we have 2 new areas, new Panama Canal, new Suez Canal. It's likely that there'll be seasonal opportunities, but not year-round navigation. And then finally, the things that I work on, marine safety, environmental protection, all of us in the Arctic Council, the Arctic states, are working closely together, particularly Canada and the United States, on new protection and safety measures for the top of the world. And let me stop there. The only picture of polar bears, Jack mentioned pandas, so this is polar bear country. And maybe I can take a question or two, and we're going to have our panel. So I have one more slide, but maybe I'll just show it, because I figured I might get a question on this topic. It's been in the news. Even your senators have been involved, and others, and representatives here in Michigan. Everybody wants icebreakers, some for the Great Lakes, but what America needs today are some new Coast Guard icebreakers to fill the whole of the complex. Canada as well. Canada has, hopefully will build a Diefenbacher, new polar icebreaker one day, maybe soon. And it's on the books anyway. And we hopefully will, we, the United States, will build some icebreakers for all of these reasons: sovereign control and presence in the Antarctic and the Arctic, and all the Coast Guard missions and attendant federal responsibilities at both ends of the world. But I can answer questions a little bit more in depth on this stuff. This picture is the Polar Sea when I was a captain 20-some years ago. But Mount Erebus is in the background, so the only really active volcano in the Antarctic, and so you can park the ship and then have the backdrop about 20 miles, 30 miles away is this big mountain. But you can see all the crew on the ice and parked in the ice. Ice there is about 6.5 feet thick, and you just drive the ship up and park and you would get off. But the icebreakers are, I would argue, are part of the national inventory. We have every other conceivable ship in the inventory of the United States, particularly nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers, largest navy on the planet. The missing link is a robust fleet of icebreakers, maybe 2, 3, 4, to handle our sovereign interests and national interests at both ends of the world. Thank you.